On certain winter nights in medieval Europe, temperatures dropped to 20 below zero. Inside your home, there would be no insulation, no central heating, and the fireplace could barely warm the room it was sitting in. So, how did millions of peasants not just survive this every single year, but some of them literally went to sleep in the fall and didn't wake up until spring? This is one of the most bizarre stories of everyday medieval life. Because the answer is not they built a big fire and bundled up. Their actual survival strategy defies almost everything you picture about that era. And the strangest part? Part of that strategy involved sharing your bed with something you would never ever allow in your bedroom. First, you need to understand something. The medieval winter was not like the winter you know. Starting around the year 1300, Europe entered a period scientists call the Little Ice Age, and it would last nearly 5 centuries. Global temperatures dropped enough to transform entire landscapes. The River Thames in London, the same river that never freezes today, froze solid at least 24 times between 1400 and 1831, and it didn't freeze lightly. During the winter of 1683, the ice reached almost 12 inches thick and lasted 2 solid months. People crossed the river on foot, in carts, on horseback. They set up booths on the ice and sold food, cut hair, played bowling. King Charles II bought a printed souvenir from a typesetting press assembled in the middle of the frozen Thames. And this was London, southern England, relatively mild climate. Now, imagine what was happening further north, in Scandinavia, in the Alps, on the plains of Central Europe, where peasants lived in houses with woven mud walls and a hole in the roof as a ventilation system. These were the winters they had to survive. And you're probably thinking, okay, but at least they had fire. This is where the obvious answer starts to fall apart. Yes, medieval peasants had fire. A stone hearth in the center of the room, or sometimes right on the ground. Smoke drifted up through an open hole in the roof. Sounds functional. But in practice, these houses had gaps everywhere. The wattle and daub walls barely insulated anything. Wind blew under the doors between the beams through windows that often didn't even have glass, just a piece of cloth or a wooden shutter. So something almost contradictory happened. The fireplace burned around the clock, the house was constantly filled with smoke, and it was still cold enough for people to wear their outdoor clothes indoors. When they went to church, they carried small, hollow metal spheres filled with hot coals in their pockets. Portable hand warmers, because even the church couldn't escape the cold. Fire helped. But on its own, it was nowhere near enough. So what actually kept these people alive through months of freezing temperatures? The answer starts with something you probably wouldn't associate with a heating system. But that worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without burning a single piece of wood. Cattle, cows, sheep, goats, pigs. Every large animal produces constant body heat. And in an enclosed space, that heat adds up. Medieval peasants didn't just know this, they built their homes around it. Across much of northern Europe, from Scandinavia to Germany through Scotland and Wales, the dominant housing model was the longhouse, or byre dwelling, a long timber structure where the family lived on one side and the livestock stayed on the other, separated by an internal wall, all under the same roof. Archaeological evidence from Bohemia and southern Germany confirms this 3-compartment layout: living room, animal stalls, and barn, as standard by the late 13th century. And this wasn't improvised. The partition between humans and animals was designed to let the heat through. In some Frisian longhouses, inventories from the 16th and 17th centuries show structures over 100 feet long housing 40 to 60 cows on one side alone. Now, picture the heat generated by 60 cows in an enclosed space in the middle of January. It was like a biological radiator running non-stop. And on top of that, entire families slept together, packed tightly, adding human warmth to animal warmth. It wasn't discomfort, it was thermal engineering. But keeping the body warm required more than external heat. It required calories, and a lot of them. And this is where one of the most intense rituals in the medieval calendar comes in. One that began every November and turned entire villages into production lines. The Anglo-Saxons called November Blot Monath, the month of slaughter. The monk Bede, writing in the year 725, recorded that this was the month when cattle destined to be put down were consecrated. The logic was brutal and precise. After summer, the pasture dried up, stored hay was limited, and feeding the entire herd through winter meant spending grain that humans needed to survive. So, the decision was made. Only the strongest animals, the breeders and the dairy cows, made it past St. Martin's Day, November the 11th. The rest were taken down. And then, the real work began. The meat was cut, soaked in brine for days, then hung to smoke or stacked in barrels with layers of coarse salt between each piece. The salt drew out moisture and prevented decay, but it also made the meat so intensely salty that it needed hours of boiling before you could eat it. And that's exactly why the medieval winter was dominated by stews, pottages, and thick soups, not roasted meat. Roasting was for summer. In winter, everything boiled. Every part of the animal was used. The hide became leather. The bones became tools. The tallow became candles, which were the only source of light during nights that lasted 16 hours. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be. Now think about what they wore. Wool was the fabric of winter. Affordable, warm, durable. But raw wool was so itchy it was impossible to wear directly on the skin. So underneath everything went a layer of linen, lighter, softer, and crucially, it absorbed sweat. Because wool loses efficiency when it gets wet, and medieval people knew this. They had the habit of removing layers when they started sweating and putting them back on when they cooled down. A thermal regulation system that any modern mountaineering manual would recommend today. And at night, they slept in caps because the head is one of the body's biggest points of heat loss. They heated stones or bricks in the fireplace, wrapped them in cloth, and placed them inside the bed to warm the sheets before lying down. In Scandinavia and the Netherlands, where ice took over canals and rivers, people traveled across the frozen surface on skates made from animal bones. The London Museum has specimens dating back to the 1100s. Horse and ox bones, polished smooth and strapped to the feet with leather ties. It sounds primitive, but it was the most efficient transportation available when the world turned to ice. Look at what's happening here. None of these things worked alone. Fire alone wasn't enough. Clothing alone wasn't enough. The food, the cattle, the heated stones, none of it in isolation would keep someone alive through months of sub-zero temperatures. What kept them alive was the entire system working together. The house designed to capture animal heat. The food prepared months in advance to generate caloric energy inside the body. The layered clothing to retain that heat. The fire as a supplement. And above all, collective life. Families sleeping together. Villages gathering in the warmest building available, usually the church, to share body heat and resources. Remember what I said at the beginning, that their real strategy defies what you picture about that era? This is it. It wasn't a solution. It was an integrated survival network where every piece depended on all the others. Remove one, and the system breaks. But some communities went even further, much further. And what they did sounds so unlikely that when the first accounts reached the modern world, many people simply didn't believe it. In the French Alps, there was a saying, 7 months of winter, 5 months of hell. The hell was the non-stop labor of summer. When it ended, according to historian Graham Robb, entire communities simply vanished. Economists and bureaucrats who ventured into the French countryside after the revolution were stunned to find whole villages sitting in absolute silence for months. Barely any smoke rising from chimneys, fields deserted from Flanders to Provence. People locked themselves indoors with their animals, reduced all activity to a minimum, and basically slept. They ate 1 meal a day, sometimes less, and went back to bed. The goal was to slow the body down so the stored food would last until spring. The most detailed surviving accounts come from the 19th century, not the Middle Ages itself, but the rural logic had been the same for generations. In 1900, the British Medical Journal reported that peasants in the Pskov region of northwestern Russia adopted what they called the economical expedient of spending half the year asleep. If someone in the family passed away during those months, the body was kept on the roof covered in snow until the ground thawed enough to dig a grave in spring. It wasn't biological hibernation in the strict sense, but it was the closest a human being has ever come. And here's what makes this story so striking. Because while some communities responded to winter by shutting down, sleeping, slowing, disappearing, others did the exact opposite. When the Thames froze in 1608, Londoners didn't panic. They set up a fair on the ice. Food stalls, barbershops, printing presses, bowling games, horse races, all on the frozen river. Over the following decades, these fairs became tradition. At the most famous one, in the winter of 1683, the king strolled across the ice, people bought souvenir prints made right there on the spot, and whole oxen were roasted in the middle of the river. In 1814, at the last fair before the climate started warming, someone brought an elephant to walk on the Thames. An elephant. On the ice. In the middle of London. Sleeping for months or throwing a party on the frozen river. The two responses seem like opposites, but deep down, they're the same thing. Remember the survival network? The quiet version and the loud version ran on the same engine. Community. Nobody hibernated alone. They slept packed together, whole families sharing heat and food. Nobody set up a fair alone. It was the entire village turning a catastrophe into something bearable. The medieval winter wasn't conquered by individuals. It was conquered by groups who understood something we may have forgotten. So how did medieval peasants survive winter without heating? Not with one answer, with a system. The house was designed to capture the heat of livestock. The food was prepared months in advance to keep the body generating energy. Layered clothing retained that heat. And when all of that still wasn't enough, they played their last card. Some shut the body down and slept until spring. Others walked out onto the ice and turned disaster into celebration. But in every case, the piece that held everything together was the same. Nobody faced winter alone. Today, we have central heating, thermal insulation, fresh food year-round. And still, on the first cold day, we complain. Maybe the most interesting question isn't how they survived, but what exactly we've lost since then. What do you think? If you enjoyed this story, subscribe. There are plenty more where this came from. See you in the next one.